Welcome to Heart of the Shepherd as we continue our study in the book of Nehemiah. We are today in chapters 5 and 6. However, this is the first of two video devotionals, and it is taken from Nehemiah chapter 5. The title of the devotion is The Cry of the Oppressed. Well, rebuilding the walls and setting the gates was an all-consuming mission for Nehemiah. Now, unfortunately, his effort to restore the walls of Jerusalem invited immense opposition from enemies who used it as an opportunity to openly mock, ridicule, and oppose him. Well, adding to Nehemiah's burdens was a crisis that arises in this particular chapter when wealthy men abused their privilege, failed to observe God's laws, and showed no compassion for the poor. Consider with me then Nehemiah chapter 5. Now, in the first 4 verses, we have the cry of the needy. Now, poverty was prevalent in Israel, and many who worked on the walls and gates of Jerusalem neglected their farms and borrowed to provide food for their families. And here we find that they complained that they were forced to pledge their own sons and daughters and mortgage their houses and fields to purchase grain. Well, adding to their financial hardships was the king's tax assessment on their lands and vineyards. Well, we have in verses 5 through 8 where Nehemiah now confronts what I would describe as greedy leaders. Tragically, wealthy lenders who gave no regard to the poor began foreclosing on their debtors' properties. Those unscrupulous men went so far as to enslave the sons and daughters of those who could not pay their debts. Well, it would be resolved in verses 7 through 13 in what was a public rebuke. Now, Nehemiah was indignant when he learned of the abuses of the wealthy. And in oppressing the poor, the wealthy had violated God's law. And therefore Nehemiah publicly rebuked those of exacting usury, that is, excessive interest. Much like unscrupulous lenders in our day, the rich had charged exorbitant interest rates, making it impossible for the debtors to repay their creditors. So Nehemiah reminded the wealthy that he had the authority to exact of them money and corn, but he had not exercised his right. He urged them, leave off this usury in verse 10, and warned God would judge them harshly for oppressing the people. Well, fortunately, as you read verses 11 through 13, the crisis ended when the elders agreed to release the people of their debts and restore all they had taken unlawfully. And then we'll consider with me, just in closing, Nehemiah's character and example that we identify in verses 14 through 19. Now, these closing verses reveal to us that 12 years passed since Nehemiah became governor of Judah and began to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Well, unlike the governors before him, Nehemiah did not enrich himself by taking advantage of his office. He had refused to burden the people with the needs of his household, lest he sacrifice God's blessings in verse 15. Well, because he feared God, Nehemiah did not require the people to provide food for his table. Well, in closing, Nehemiah knew what it meant to fear, revere, and please God. And he was confident that the Lord honors those who faithfully labor and do his will. And so Nehemiah prayed in verse 9, think upon me, my God, for good according to all that I have done for this people. Well, as I bring this to a close, I want to bring it to an invitation that you might recognize in Nehemiah a great model of servant leadership. In a world dominated by self-serving leaders, believers would do well to remember that God is the judge, and we should therefore fear and revere him. Verse 15. Well, I will close this first of 2 daily devotionals. I invite you to continue to Nehemiah chapter 6, where we will consider more of the servant leadership qualities that we see and identify in the life of Nehemiah. God bless you, and bye-bye.